In 1990, a British documentary took cameras into the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta and returned with an idea that would outlive the film itself. The Kogi people, presented to the world as the elder brothers, guardians of a civilization the conquest never truly reached. Isolated, unchanged, a living fossil of pre-Columbian America, still speaking to mountains the rest of humanity had stopped listening to. That image stuck. It found its way into textbooks, travel features, university lectures on indigenous resilience. And the Kogi were never treated as an isolated case. Colombia's entire indigenous landscape got mapped the same way, as a set of separate, self-contained peoples, each one a closed capsule preserving its own unbroken line back to the deep past. Anthropology courses still teach the country's native groups through three great linguistic families. Chibcha in the highlands, Carib along the coasts and river mouths, Arawak pushing in from the Amazon and the Caribbean basin. Neat borders on a neat map. Wayuu here, Kogi and Arwako there, Nukak deep in the forest, Zenú goldsmiths confined to the lowlands near the Zenú River, as though each group had simply always occupied its assigned territory, untouched by the others, resistant to time itself. The logic felt airtight for over a century. Mountain ranges and river systems in Colombia are genuinely extreme, the kind of terrain that isolates a village for generations without a single outsider passing through. If the geography can seal a people off, why wouldn't their blood, language, and customs stay sealed off too? Colonial-era chroniclers reinforce the assumption, describing the highland Muisca as though they had vanished entirely by the 18th century, absorbed so completely into mestizo society that nothing indigenous survived beneath the surface. 20th century census categories did the rest, sorting the population into indigena, mestizo, and blanco, as if those boxes reflected something biological rather than administrative. It made for a tidy national story. Ancient tribes, frozen or vanished. A mixed majority descended mostly from Spanish settlers and enslaved Africans, with only a faint, symbolic trace of the original inhabitants left in the blood. Even now, walk through a museum in Bogotá and the exhibits are arranged exactly this way. Pre-Columbian rooms sealed off from the colonial ones, as if one culture ended precisely where the other began. But archaeologists working the same valleys the Kogi call home started noticing details that refused to sit inside those clean borders. Trade goods from hundreds of kilometers away, turning up in supposedly isolated villages. Genetic samples that match populations they weren't supposed to be related to at all. The map, it turned out, had never really matched the ground. Take the Zenú. Colonial administrators filed them away as a lowland goldsmithing people, confined to the marshlands around the Zenú and San Jorge rivers, their territory drawn as a modest patch on any map of pre-Hispanic Colombia. Yet metallurgists studying Zenú gold work kept finding techniques, the same alloy ratios, the same filigree patterns, turning up in pieces recovered hundreds of kilometers away, in regions supposedly occupied by entirely unrelated peoples. Either the objects traveled without the people who made them, passed hand to hand along trade routes historians hadn't fully mapped, or the Zenú themselves moved farther and more often than the neat territorial lines ever allowed for. Both explanations break the old picture of a static, boxed-in culture. The Sierra Nevada told a stranger version of the same problem. Kogi, Arwako, Wayuu, and Kankwamo communities share the mountain, share ceremonial concepts, and for decades got treated in academic writing almost as branches of one tree. Descendants of the Tairona civilization the Spanish encountered along that coast in the 16th century, splintered but fundamentally continuous. Linguists complicated that story first. Their languages, while related, diverged with a depth that suggested separation measured in millennia rather than centuries. Far longer than the few hundred years since the conquest scattered Tairona towns into the highlands. If the split happened that long ago, unbroken continuity from Tairona to Kogi stops being a simple fact and starts looking like a story built backward from a documentary crew's expectations. Then there was the Muisca problem. Officially, the Muisca, the confederation that once controlled the high plains around what is now Bogotá, had been absorbed so thoroughly into colonial society by the 1700s that Colombian textbooks routinely described them in the past tense, a people who existed rather than a people who exist. Yet oral tradition never fully agreed with that verdict. Communities in Kota, Chia, and Suba kept ceremonies alive, kept language fragments alive, insisted for generations that Muisca identity hadn't vanished, only gone unrecognized. For most of the 20th century, historians treated those claims as sentiment rather than evidence, folklore dressed up as ancestry. That dismissal became harder to defend once population geneticists started sampling. Researchers working on Latin American genetic structure in the 2010s began pulling mitochondrial and autosomal data from people who, on paper, had no indigenous identity at all. Families in Bogotá and Boyacá who self-identified as mestizo or even white, with Spanish surnames going back generations. A striking share of them carried maternal lineages tracing directly to Native American populations, a signal too consistent, too widespread across unrelated families to explain away as coincidence or contamination. Whatever colonial paperwork had erased on the surface, the bloodlines underneath had kept a different record entirely. The Muisca case turned out to be one thread in a much larger pattern. When geneticists began comparing genome-wide data across dozens of Colombian indigenous and mixed populations, the tidy three-family map, Chibcha, Carib, Arawak, kept failing to predict who was actually related to whom. Groups classified together by language sometimes showed deep genetic separation, as if they had followed different paths into the region and only later ended up as neighbors. Groups separated by language and geography sometimes showed closer genetic kinship than either expected, hinting at contact, intermarriage, or shared ancestry the classification system was never built to capture. Language, it turned out, travels differently than genes. A community can adopt a neighbor's tongue through trade, conquest, or alliance without a matching exchange of ancestry. And the reverse happens too, populations drifting apart linguistically while remaining, underneath, close kin. Ancient DNA sharpened the picture further. Skeletal remains recovered from highland Colombian sites, sequenced over the past decade, revealed something the ethnographic model never anticipated. Multiple distinct migratory pulses reaching the northern Andes at different points, thousands of years apart, layering over one another rather than replacing each other cleanly. The people who eventually became known to the Spanish as Muisca, Zenú, or Tirona weren't simply the unbroken descendants of the very first arrivals. They were the product of repeated waves of movement and mixture stretching back far deeper than any colonial chronicle bothered to record. The Wayuu offered a different kind of correction. La Guajira's desert isolation made them the textbook example of a self-contained matrilineal society, culturally distinct from every neighboring group by design, according to most ethnographies. Genetic surveys instead found substantial gene flow connecting Wayuu lineages to populations across the wider Caribbean basin. Traces of exchange with groups well beyond the peninsula's supposed cultural wall. Isolation, in practice, had never been absolute. It had been selective, maintained in language and custom while blood moved more freely across the boundary than anyone assumed. Even the Nukak, often introduced in documentaries as one of the last uncontacted peoples of the Amazon, first approached by outsiders only in 1988, turned out not to represent some ancient, untouched branch frozen since the earliest migrations into South America. Genetic dating placed their divergence from neighboring Amazonian groups at a few centuries, not millennia, suggesting a much more recent split, possibly tied to conflict or displacement rather than deep isolation stretching back to the first humans on the continent. Every answer kept generating the same follow-up. If none of these groups had ever really been sealed off, if blood moved even when culture and language didn't, then what precisely had survived intact long enough to still be called Colombian, indigenous, and unbroken today? The answer, once researchers stopped looking for purity and started looking for continuity, turned out to be simpler and stranger than either the myth or its collapse suggested. What survived wasn't sealed bloodlines. It was the deliberate, repeated act of staying identifiable, choosing generation after generation to keep a name, a ceremony, a language fragment, a claim to land, even while the biology underneath kept mixing with everyone the community came into contact with. Identity in Colombia's indigenous history never depended on isolation. It depended on people refusing to let mixture erase who they said they were. That reframing changed how the Muisca extinction reads today. Colombia's government formally recognized Muisca cabildos in Cota, Chía, Suba, and several other municipalities only in recent decades. Legal acknowledgement of communities that official history had already written off 2 centuries earlier. Genetics didn't hand these communities their identity. It confirmed something they had been asserting the entire time, against a paperwork trail that said otherwise. The DNA was corroboration, not discovery, evidence catching up to a claim that had never actually gone silent. It also reframes the Kogi. The 1990 documentary wasn't wrong that something remarkable survived in the Sierra Nevada, a body of ecological and spiritual knowledge maintained with real discipline across generations. It was wrong about why. Not because the Kogi sat outside history while everyone else moved through it, but because they, like the Zenú traders, the Wayuu families with Caribbean-wide kinship networks, and the Muisca descendants scattered through Bogotá's mestizo population, kept choosing continuity inside a region defined by constant contact, not despite it. The elder brothers framing sold isolation. What the evidence actually supports is something closer to persistence under pressure, a harder, less romantic, more human story. For millions of Colombians today, this history isn't academic. Consumer DNA testing has become common enough in Bogotá and Medellin that families with no oral memory of indigenous ancestry are discovering measurable Native American maternal lineages reading through records that list only Spanish surnames going back 3 centuries. Some are reaching out to cabildos. Some are simply recalculating, quietly, what mestizo ever really meant in a country that spent 200 years treating it as a synonym for Spanish plus a little something else, rather than what the genome actually shows, a deep, layered, continuously renewed inheritance from dozens of distinct peoples who never fully disappeared. The tribe were never frozen relics waiting to be found intact or declared gone. They were participants in an unbroken, ongoing exchange, one that the maps, the census categories, and even the documentaries got only partly right because the truest record was never written down. It was carried, cell by cell, into the present, waiting for the tools to finally read it.